executive orders to reverse DEI at the federal level, a wave of outrage has erupted from certain groups. But what exactly is this outrage rooted in? Oftentimes, these reactions often lack a deep understanding and truthfulness regarding the core of DEI and its underlying agenda. Let me explain. We face a critical crossroads in America. Over the past several years, a silent yet powerful agenda was emerging, wearing the noble mask of diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI. On the surface, this might seem like a commendable initiative, aiming for wider representation across genders, ethnicities, and socioeconomic backgrounds. But what has appeared virtuous at first glance hides a more complex and potentially dangerous reality. Over the past 4 years, DEI initiatives have increasingly infiltrated every tier of our society. This pervasive presence feels different, though, when it reaches the core of our trusted institutions, the professions we rely upon, sometimes with our very lives. Think about this when it comes to the pilots flying our skies or the medical professionals entrusted with our health. Now consider this. When an individual is rushed to a hospital in a life or death emergency, they don't stop to ask about the skin color of the surgeon about to perform a critical procedure. No, their hope, our collective hope, is that the individual wielding the scalpel is the best, the most competent, and thoroughly prepared for the intense pressure of the operating room. After all, medical school and specialized surgical residencies have long been the epitome of rigorous selection and preparation. Or have they? What if in the name of diversity, I was to tell you that medical institutions are now lowering entrance standards and pushing certain candidates forward based not on merit, but on skin color? This unsettling reality challenges the very foundation of what it means to provide and receive the best care possible and prioritizes diversity policy over safety. It's a chilling thought and why we're here today. Dr. Richard Bosshardt is with us and brings a vital perspective to this discussion. His insights may unsettle you, but they are too important to be ignored. Despite attempts to silence and suppress his voice, we offer him a platform to share his experiences and concerns. And we urge you, the viewer, to consider the implications of a system that might prioritize diversity over competence, especially in fields where excellence is non-negotiable. As we hear from Dr. Bosshardt today, let's remember, it's not just a conversation, it's a call to action. So please share his message and help me spread his awareness. Stand up for a system where integrity, merit, and excellency are upheld for all, regardless of their background. Dr. Rick Bosshardt, thank you so much for joining us today. You are a plastic surgeon.
Yes.
You are a fellow of the American College of Surgeons. Still a senior fellow of Do No Harm and a founding fellow of the Fair in Medicine organization. And we're going to get to all of that here in a second. But thank you. Thank you for flying all the way down here and joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate that.
Absolutely. This is such an important conversation. When you and I talked in preparation for this episode, there's so much going on that I think people are unaware of. And so I really appreciate you taking the time to come down here. Why don't we just start with you tell us your background in what you're doing?
Well, I'm sometimes a bit surprised to be sitting in a place like this, doing what I'm doing right now. I had a long and very satisfying career as a doctor, 35 years of that spent as a plastic surgeon in practice in Central Florida, and was just happily, doing my thing in my little community and involved. And I wasn't ever into what I would call activism or advocacy. And then over the course of a few years, that changed pretty radically. And I suddenly found myself in the middle of a storm of controversy. I don't know if I should just briefly summarize my situation with respect to the American College of Surgeons.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a large part of your story. I wanted people to know, though, your history with being a plastic surgeon in good standing. But yeah, why don't you tell us what you said? You weren't an activist before this. So what happened? What changed?
What happened was that I am as indicated, a fellow in the American College of Surgeons. I'm going to abbreviate to ACS instead of having to repeat it. The ACS is the oldest and largest organization representing surgery in the world. It's founded in 1913. It has something like 90,000 members or thereabouts. And admission to the ACS as a fellow is something which is done by invitation. You're recommended by a couple of fellows. You have to provide proof of practice for a minimum of a year. You have to have a clean record with respect to things like, malpractice and other issues. And it's a process. And the admission allows you to put the initials FACS, Fellow of the American College of Surgeons, after your MD, which is something that I always sought. Even when I was in my surgical training, I realized I wanted that validation that I was committed to excellence, which is the whole goal of the ACS, at least it used to be. So I wasn't really involved in the ACS actively because there's only limited time when you're in a busy practice. And I was involved in my local medical community, my local medical society. I was chief of surgery at my hospital for a while. And in 2019, for some silly reason, I happened to read the transcript of a lecture given at the American College of Surgeons Annual Clinical Congress. The lecture was titled A Pathway to Diversity, Excellence, and Inclusion. They didn't throw in the DEI quite at that time.
It was DEI, just a
it
different
was
DEI acronym.
It was not mentioned as such. But what's interesting is I read the entire transcript, and the word excellence outside of the title never appeared. It was all about diversity. And I thought, that doesn't sound right. I mean, if it's anything that needs to have a priority, top priority in something like surgery, it has to be excellence. Competence, excellence, call it what you will, but you have to have competent surgeons that you can trust. I sent a comment in that was published in the bulletin of the ACS. It didn't really get any response.
What was that comment? Do you remember?
I commented my concern about the exclusion of excellence, about promoting diversity over excellence, and the fact that while diversity is a wonderful thing and no one is going to claim otherwise, it should be the primary focus of an organization like the American College of Surgeons. 3 of the surgeons commented, by the way. Mine was by far the longest because I like to write, so I get long-winded. And the other 3 surgeons basically said the same thing in a few sentences where I put in many paragraphs. And nothing happened with that, and I went along. And then, of course, the bottom of the world fell out with COVID in 2020, and everything stopped. And in 2020, what was the other major event? Of course, George Floyd. And after the killing of George Floyd, there was this massive rush of what appeared to be everything in the country, every institution, every organization, every corporation, to try and put out their bona fides as far as promoting anti-racism and supporting the claim that there was systemic racism everywhere and we had to root it out and get rid of it. And the ACS was no different. They did the same thing. They promoted or put together a task force on racism. The task force recommendations came out in November of 2020. And they basically put out what amounts to a primer on how to install critical race theory, which later is more commonly referred to as DEI because it doesn't sound so bad, I guess. And so they installed anti-racism into the values of the ACS. They opened up a new department of diversity in the ACS with its own clinical director, who was became one of the board of regents, which is the ruling body of the ACS. And they started training the staff on things like microaggressions, implicit bias, all the things you read about that have to do with DEI. Basically, surgeons were told that they were racist, that the ACS was a racist organization, and that Surge itself was racist. And I didn't like that. I don't like being called a racist. I'm not a racist. They claim that even making that statement is a racist statement, believe it or not. It's kind of a catch-22. And so, of course, I sat down and wrote a long letter to the then president of the ACS, and I listed my strong objections to characterizing this institution, which has been committed to excellence in surgery. The mission statement of the ACS is to serve all with skill and fidelity, with skill and trust. And I,
How were you seeing when did this become a concern to you? Not just that they would put um, these courses in for people to learn about this and to help kind of battle what they were calling racism in surgery, but how was this practically impacting the medical field and industry itself? Did this start to spill over into the standards that were being set in order to meet a specific diversity goal?
well, first off, I've never seen racism in implicit or explicitly in practice. I've worked with surgeons of every race and ethnicity. I've had them in the training program that I was trained in. I've worked with Black surgeons who helped train me. It's I'll just use the term Black because that kind of, it's all ethnicities, but it seems to be more of a Black-white issue than anything else. The only thing that has ever come up as far as evidence for this structural or systemic racism has been the presence of disparities. The disparities being that, for example, Blacks are not represented in surgery in the same proportion in which they are in our general population, which is to say there's 13% Black individuals in our population. Therefore, if we don't have 13% Blacks in surgery, that indicates discrimination. The disparity itself is proof of discrimination. And that also applies to, and this is where things really get bad, when you look at outcomes of surgery. If you look at, Blacks compared to whites, the outcomes for surgery in Blacks does not tend to be as good. In other words, they don't do as well after more complications, for example, and results aren't as good and things like that. So again, the premise is that these disparities reflect explicit or implicit racial prejudice on the part of surgeons. And this has raised something which I had never heard of until recently, which is the concept of racial concordance. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but it's such an important thing that I don't mind doing that. Racial concordance basically says that people will do better if they have a surgeon of their own race or ethnicity. So that
is there proof?
No proof
for that.
The Do No Harm. One of the things that Do No Harm has done, which has been tremendous, is they put out multiple databases and they do extensive systematic reviews, I should say, of studies. And they've done a systematic review of studies that purport to show that there's racial concordance. For example, the one that's most cited that I have seen states that Black babies do not do as well unless their doctor is a Black doctor. And that has been thoroughly discredited, but it's still quoted widely as proof of racial concordance. But if you do a systematic study, you find that that is absolutely a false conclusion. So, these sorts of things, disparities, were basically the only thing that they've ever been able to demonstrate or point to as a sign of systemic racism. Getting back just briefly to what happened with me, I sent this letter to the president of the ACS, and I said, I take issue with this. And on behalf of my fellow surgeons, I think it's a slap in the face to say that surgeons are racist and this impacts their treatment of patients. Also, it's tremendously toxic to trust if you can't trust your surgeon. If you are, for example, a minority person in an emergency room and your surgeon walks in and happens to be a white surgeon, I mean, do you want that individual thinking, oh my gosh, I'm not going to get as good a care because white surgeons are racists? And there's no evidence of that. So I told the ACS president, I said, if this continues on this course, I'm going to resign or give up my fellowship or whatever. Not much of a threat because I'm one out of 90,000, but I figured that I at least felt I needed to take a stand. That letter received no response whatsoever. I didn't even get an answer. So the next thing I did was I went to the ACS website where they have what they call the communities. The communities is a discussion forum. And surgeons can go on there, and there's different forums. There's a general surgery forum, a women's forum, and things of that sort. And the largest is by far the general surgery. So I went on the general surgery forum, and I said, this is what's happened. I disagree with it. I object to being called racist. I think this is a bad thing for the ACS to do, to introduce critical race theory into the ACS. And if this doesn't stop, I'm going to resign my fellowship. That comment, that post that I put in, generated a comment thread that lasted 4 months, started in April and pretty much died out by August of 2021. And it generated over 1,000 comments. It basically broke the system. They had to go to a second comment thread. And 75 individual surgeons commented on that, 2/3 of whom agreed with me. And if you know anything about things like, comment threads and reviews, the people that actually participate in those comment threads reflect only about 1 to 10% of the people that are actually reading it and engaging, but engaging quietly. And I received many private messages on my my mailbox in the ACS from minority surgeons saying that they agreed with me. They didn't want to be thought to have been advanced by virtue of being Black. They wanted to have been advanced by virtue of their competence and their abilities. They couldn't say that because they would have been, deemed, non-Black or a traitor to their demographic or whatnot. But I got a lot of support privately. That comment thread gradually died out, and at that point, I was thinking, well, I've done what I can do. Do I want to quit the ACS? I decided I was not going to drop out yet. I was going to continue to work within the system. And lo and behold, in 2021, at the end of the year, I received an invitation to get on a Zoom call with leaders of the ACS. And that Zoom call took place in March of 2023. I'm sorry, 22, excuse me. I'm trying to keep my years straight. They held off a little bit on doing it until March of 2022 because they were bringing on their new director of diversity. So I did a Zoom call in March of 22, and that Zoom call had 5 individuals. It was myself. There was the general secretary of the ACS, Tyler Hughes, who was the editor-in-chief of the Communities and did not like what I was saying. There was Dr. Tim Eberlein, who is a very respected surgeon at a major institution, and one of the regents of the Board of Regents. There was this Dr. Bonnie Mason, who was the new director of diversity. And the 5th member of the Zoom call participant was Dr. Celia Nelson, who is a colleague of mine in my community that I've worked with for 30 years. And Celia is a good friend and happens to be a Black female surgeon. And interestingly, she supported me fully in my disagreement with the ACS. Had a wonderful Zoom call. Everyone spoke and had their turn and said their piece. No real conclusions or decisions were made, but I was so encouraged.
What was the purpose of this call?
To hear everybody out. They wanted to hear me out. They wanted to have their say as to what they were doing and why they were doing these things. None of which really, to me, made it any better that they were doing what they were doing. Interestingly, they denied that they were putting critical race theory and DEI into the ACS. They called it something else. They said it's not the same one as you hear about. And then they went ahead and invited Ibram Kendi as their keynote speaker at a retreat they had on diversity. So they were talking out of 2 corners of their mouth. One side was saying this is not DEI. The other side is doing all the things that DEI would call for. But I was so pleased just to have this engagement that I sent emails and said, thank you for the invitation. I hope this will spark some conversation and discussion and debate about this issue in the ACS. And within weeks, I was banned. I was unable to get onto the Communities at all. I could not access the members directory. I could not even access my own private mailbox in the ACS. And after a couple of weeks of being unable to do this, I realized this is not just some kind of a technical glitch or something going on. And I contacted Tyler Hughes, the general secretary, and said, Tyler, what's going on? I can't access the Communities. He said, oh, you're banned. You're permanently banned.
And what reason did he give you for that?
He gave me 2 reasons. The 2 reasons they gave were my continuous use of disrespectful language, and that's a direct quote, and posting inappropriate comments, posting non-clinical material on the clinical forums, because I had posted on the general surgery forum. So my first response was, what did I say? Can you give me an example of anything that I said that justifies a lifetime ban. And he couldn't and didn't, and they never have. I have never received a single example of something that I said or wrote that would justify a ban, much less a lifetime ban. So I appealed. I still working within the ACI. I said, listen, I want to find out, number one, why. No one's told me why. All they tell me is I'm using disrespectful language and putting inappropriate material. The inappropriate material is interesting because the whole premise of installing all these DEI initiatives into the ACS is in large part because of the disparities in outcomes of surgery. So in order to correct the disparities, we have to get more Black and ethnic surgeons into the ACS. So when you start talking about surgical outcomes, you're talking about clinical material.
Well, can we talk about that too? Like what schools are actually doing? So now the DEI initiatives have moved into pretty much all sectors of our society. And when it comes to medical schools, can you talk to us a little bit about what does that mean when these schools are setting policies or goals that they're trying to reach in order to close that disparity gap, so to speak? What is happening in schools that is making it easier to meet those goals?
What they have done is they've changed admission requirements.
How?
They look at demographics really, really hard. So if you are for example, a Black female, you're going to be moved to the top of the pile when it comes to reviewing potential candidates for admission to medical school. It's going to give you a leg up, for sure. And that's been shown over and over again because the recent Supreme Court decision arose against affirmative action arose because Asian students realized that they were being discriminated against because they were overrepresented in medical schools. They were more than their representation in the community. And for that reason, they sued and they won. And that's when the Supreme Court decision I'm really terrible with names. I can't recall the name of the decision. But it came out and said you cannot have this sort of affirmative action.
So take me back when if you remember this, when you were going through medical school, how did a candidate know that they were going to be a good candidate to be looked at for that program?
Grades primarily. There's two things that medical school, well, I've gone back and looked at this, which is really interesting because the whole issue of diversity is not a new issue. When I was a medical student, you had to be in the top tier of your class with respect to grades. If you were not up there with a grade point average, in the nearly the 4 range, 4 being an A, 3.9, 3, whatever, you were definitely going to be handicapped in terms of being considered. And then they have a thing called the MedCat, the Medical College Aptitude Test, and that was a test that everybody took. Not everyone takes it. They've eliminated a lot of medical schools because it seems to disadvantage minority students.
And that's something I don't think people understand. As I was going through this research, I didn't realize that. I mean, Pennsylvania Medical School, the Pullman School of Medicine, was one of the first to drop the MCATs. Am I correct?
I believe so.
And then that spread. So a lot of people don't even realize now that and does that go for any student doesn't have to take the MCAT now in order to apply to these certain schools?
I can't tell you that for a fact for any particular school that it's across the board. I do know that many schools have eliminated the MedCat altogether for everybody. So they don't even have to take it anymore. I can't say that some students don't take it and include it in their application, but it's not a requirement.
So now the requirements to get in are, we have these quotas to fill. It doesn't matter how we get there. We have to fill these diversity quotas. Is that correct?
People will argue that they're not doing quotas when in fact they are. That's part of the problem is, quotas, first off, quotas are unconstitutional according to the first, the 14th Amendment, the equal opportunity clause of the 14th Amendment. So you can't do quotas. That's not constitutional. So you have to find some other way to do this. So they get around it by calling it other things. And I don't know, I'm not privy to exactly how these things play out on a day-to-day basis. But when you have these panels and committees that are reviewing students for admission to medical school, what happens is that you could fill a medical school class in any school in the country with straight A students that have stellar resumes academically. I mean, it would be no problem because most medical schools have many, many more applicants than they have places for students. So it would not be hard to do that. But going back to even to when I was in medical school, 45 plus years ago, they always look for other things. They look for students. They tried to put in students that had relatively interesting backgrounds and had done certain things. So that's nothing new about that. In my class, we were 76% white male. We were, I believe, about 12% Hispanic. We were 6.5% female. And I remember looking around my medical school class, even before this all was on the radar, say, wow, what an interesting group of people. We had a former professional ballerina from the New York Ballet Company. We had a captain in the Marine Corps who had done 3 tours in Vietnam flying F-4 Phantoms. We had one of our black students was a 30-some-year-old pharmacist that wanted to go back to medical school. We called our Jewish mother. We had a housewife who had raised her kid and decided she wanted to be a doctor, went back to medical school. So there was a lot of diversity. Fast forward to 2017, when my daughter went to the same medical school that I did, the medical school class was over 50% female. And the diversity in ethnicities and race was significantly greater than mine. So it's always been there. It's not been an issue. But again, you have to be able to do the work. And if you can't do well academically in college and get a decent MedCat, that does speak to your ability to do the work.
So one thing that we didn't hit on is how this is affecting minority students who are getting in, who are meeting every single qualification. How is this affecting them when they see, other DEI hires or people get into school? Are you getting any feedback from the students who are saying, well, wait a second, this isn't really fair to me because I've met every single qualification and standard to the best. I'm the top of my class. But now, is this affecting how people, look at me as a doctor?
Yes.
What are you hearing?
A lot of the comments that I received privately in my private mailbox in the ACS after I put out my post were from Black and Hispanic doctors who felt that their experience was being diminished by virtue of people looking at them now wondering if they had come through some sort of lowered standards when they had met all the standards. The doctor that was on the Zoom call with me, Dr. Celia Nelson, she had a fascinating story. But she said that when she first arrived at the hospital in our community, and she would go into a room as a female Black individual, sometimes she said to the surgeon's lounge, one surgeon asked her to get coffee. I mean, she put up with things like this, and she saw patients when she walked into the emergency room and to see a patient that they would look at her and say, and that they were wondering about this individual.
Just this reverse, this has affected them in the reverse sense.
In a sense, yes. And so what she did is she worked and she became, first off, she was an excellent surgeon because she was fully trained. And over the course of time, what she said happened is that when she would go in to see a patient in the emergency room, when she walked in the room, that patient had already heard from more than one nurse or other persons about the wonderful surgeon that was going to come and see them. And they were almost pre-prepared in a sense. And she had the same concern that now when someone sees a minority surgeon walk into a room, the question will come into their head. Is this someone who has come through because they're excellent or because they got through on lowered standards? And to me, that's terribly unfair to the persons that are doing all of the work, basically.
Is it affecting white students to the same degree? I mean, are white male students having to score higher in order to get passed along? Or now are we just lowering the standards for everybody? Because in an essence, if they're lowering the standards for everybody, it's also not safe to just say, well, I have a white male surgeon, guess everything's going to be good.
Well, there are schools that basically have a lowered level of scoring that they use for minorities than they use for example, white male students or Asian students. So yes, there's definitely a double or even a triple standard in terms of what they will expect. If you don't score at least so high as a white student, you're probably not going to receive consideration. Whereas you can score much lower as a Black or Hispanic or some other ethnicity and still be in the running for a position. So yes, there's definitely a more than a single standard out there.
Are you starting to see more of the doctors that fall into the category? Like, I'm sorry, I don't remember the doctor's name, the female surgeon that you were just talking about.
Dr. Nelson.
Is she wanting to be more vocal, and has she been vocal about speaking up for this?
She's been actually quite vocal. She's in the position that I was in. I mean, she's still, and she's younger than I am. She's still in a very busy active practice. And she truthfully doesn't have a lot of time. And I didn't have a lot of time when I was practicing to get into these things to the extent that I have now. She was it's funny when she first, I can't recall if I was the one that I don't think I mentioned her. I wouldn't have done that to her, but she got onto that comment thread on the ACS, and some surgeons didn't believe she was real. They didn't believe she was a real person. And she had to come on and say, yes, I'm a real person. This is me, and so forth and so on. So there was this issue that people just didn't think that a Black surgeon could possibly not support all the DEI initiatives.
One of the things that greatly concerned me as I was looking into this, it was the vice dean of education at this Perelman School of Medicine in Pennsylvania, which is a very prestigious medical school. And they said, and I quote, I'm going to find my quote here, that there is too much science in the curriculum. That's concerning to me. What are they trying to fill in place of science classes for these medical students?
It would be funny, wouldn't it be, if it wasn't so important to make a statement like that as the dean of a medical school. Just you have to wonder where they're coming from. What they're doing is they're taking students out of classes, and you have classes in all sorts of stuff: pharmacology, microbiology, of course, there's anatomy, physiology, that sort of thing, pathology, and they're replacing hours in those classes with hours in instruction on things like implicit bias. Some medical schools are really going full bore into the whole issue of indigenous and ancient medicine, as though we're going to be practicing, doing things that were being done hundreds of years ago today.
Is it safe to say they're more focused on turning our doctors into social justice warriors than they are surgeons?
That's exactly the way I would put it. Yeah.
Well, that is very concerning. I mean, because the way that I look at it, my background is in science, and I remember having very, very heavy course studies in biology, anatomy, physiology, and those classes were extremely intense. So if we've now replaced the hours with these other types of courses, how much time does that leave the student to really focus on the core competencies and the knowledge that they're going to need to head into these specific fields and residencies that they're going to go into?
The bottom line is that it obviously limits those hours because you only have so many hours in a day. So it's a zero-sum situation where if you take hours away from here, you're going to have to if you add hours here, you'd have to take them away from there because you only have a certain pool of hours.
Well, are they now more concerned about the grades in these other classes? Like, how are they having to compensate for the fact that these medical students may not have as much time in the day to study? Are they having to lower grades? Are they having to lower? One thing that I read about the shelf exams. UCLA specifically, the Free Beacon did a very interesting study on what specifically was happening at UCLA when they got a new dean of admissions over the medical school. And some of the findings, and doctors are not known to really want to speak out, especially faculty at schools like this. They are not known for wanting to step up and speak out against what's going on within their school. And so many of them were seeing such a steep decline in the skill level of many of the students that they had no other option but to speak out. And specifically, they were saying, I'm going to read some of this really fast. Okay. This was a report from the Free Beacon that uncovered some pretty disturbing data from UCLA's medical school. It said some of the cohorts had more than 50% of their students fail standardized tests on emergency medicine, family medicine, internal medicine, and pediatrics. Those tests, known as shelf exams, which are typically taken at the end of each clinical rotation, measure basic medical knowledge and play a pivotal role in residency applications. Only 5% of students fail this test nationally, but the rates were at 50% at UCLA. One of the professors said that a student in the operating room could not identify a major artery when asked, and then berated the professor for putting her on the spot. Another said that students at the end of their clinical rotations don't even know basic lab tests, and in some cases are unable to present patients. So we're not talking about a theory anymore. We are talking about how this is having actual implications in our medical field. What types of concern does this give you?
One of the things that has happened, well, of course, competence. When you talk about promoting things over and above excellence, then competence falls by the wayside as well, and you don't get the level of competence that you should expect from people at particular levels of their education. You mentioned the shelf exams. There's also a series of 3 examinations taken, the United States Medical Licensing Examination. They call them Step 1, Step 2, Step 3. Step 1 is taken after the first years of medical school. That's when you do most of your classwork. You're learning all about these things: anatomy, physiology, biochemistry, microbiology. And then you go into your clinical year. The third year is your clinical year, where you actually go in the hospital. You learn to examine patients. You learn about, the actual diseases and so forth. And the fourth year is usually kind of a year where you're allowed to pick and choose what you want to do based on your interests. So step 1 was a graded examination. And that examination was used for determining who would get into what residency programs. Residencies would look at students and invite them for interviews based on their step 1 scores. They eliminated grading because the claim was it put minority students at a disadvantage because their grades were basically lower, and they felt that was unfair. So they eliminated one significant metric for determining, who gets into elite medical residency programs. The other issue that went to was I think I'm safe saying that every medical school, every institution has now a diversity department that may have multiple administrators. And what's happened is that, the tail is now wagging the dog. And what I mean by that is that if an underrepresented student is held back, or, in the case that you mentioned, is questioned and can't answer and feels that they have been put under, undue pressure or felt made uncomfortable, they can go and complain to the diversity administrator, who will then come back, and they will always, again, I think I'm pretty safe saying this, they will always support the student over the professor. And professors have found that when they do this, they get a tremendous amount of blowback, and for them, it's just not worth doing. And so I know for a fact from speaking to people that many attending surgeons, attending physicians, professors won't do that. They won't hold back or reprimand an underperforming student because they don't want the blowback. So they'll just move them on and get them out of their area, and
So
not
they're
deal with
moving people forward through the process that may or may not be qualified to even do the job that they are supposed to do. How does this play into their boards? I mean, it sounds like this isn't even preparing people to take their medical boards. Are we lowering standards in our medical board exams as well to even become a licensed physician?
I don't know that I can say for a fact that we are. I did try to do a little research a while back to look at grades on medical boards, but there's so much variation from year to year. I think that the pass-fail rates have not significantly changed, but the standards for judging those pass-fail rates I can't speak to.
Mm-hmm. So where do grades play in when you're going into residency or a specialized field?
They would normally have played a significant role because, obviously for the same reason that medical schools want the very best students, residency programs, and especially the elite residency programs, the ones that, Harvard and Penn and places like that, they want the best of the medical students for their programs. So it makes it difficult for them to select out those particular students because, again, they don't have any kind of a standardized metric by which to judge. So a lot of it is done on the basis of things like, past experience, the essays. Of course, there's always the interview. And underlying all this is always this idea that, we have to be careful that we get enough people of certain demographic groups. Otherwise, we're going to be dinged by somebody somewhere for having, an over percentage of, white males.
What has this done for the confidence level of today's patient in our country?
If you look at a recent survey, I did read this just recently. They surveyed over 400,000 people across the country to find out what the confidence level, the trust level of trust is in hospitals and physicians. 2019, this same survey was 71% professed to be confident and trust these institutions and their physicians. In 2024, it was 41%. So there's been a tremendous drop in the trust. I can speak to that because I'm one of those. As an insider in being in medicine all my adult life, I don't have the trust in these institutions that I used to have. And I no longer trust young physicians the way I would normally have done years ago. They surveyed program directors. Well, this is interesting because in the area of general surgery, to become a general surgeon, you have to do a 5-year residency. Some add an extra year for research. Basically, it's 5 years of intense surgical training with what's called graded responsibility. You start out just, doing lab work and seeing patients on the floor. Then they let you do an operation or two. Then as time goes by, you get more responsibility. By the time you reach your 5th year, you're functioning as a full surgeon. You make your own decisions. You're training surgeons behind you. You only call in your professors if you have a complicated case or something you haven't done before. So in 5 years, you should produce a very competent general surgeon who goes out into practice and is able to practice independently, which is what my experience was when I finished my residency in 1984. They surveyed program directors, and what's been happening, and this is going back, oh my gosh, to well over 10 years, maybe 14 years more. 80% of graduating general surgery residents are not going into practice. They're going on into fellowships. A fellowship is when you do additional training of a year or more in a subspecialty. For example, a general surgeon may decide he wants to specialize in vascular or colorectal or burn or something like that. So they'll do additional training. And so now 80% of these surgeons are going on into these subspecialties and not going into general surgery.
What kind of impact is that having?
Oh, tremendous impact. If you survey the residents themselves, 55% say they do this because they're not confident in their ability to practice independently. And that's one reason that drives them into residency, into fellowships. The program directors of fellowships find that 66% of their fellows, the their new trainees in these specialties
Mm-hmm.
are not competent to operate for more than 30 minutes unsupervised in a complex operation. 30% of them can't identify anatomical planes properly. Another 30% can't perform a laparoscopic cholecystectomy, which is the basic operation.
But that's spanning
And so,
across all demographics, correct? I mean, when we're taking a general saying 30%, that's not just out of one type of demographic, that's across all students, right?
right. And the impact, when you mentioned asking the impact is basically this. Right at this moment, we have a shortage of 2,400 trauma surgeons in the USA. That's 24 places that need a trauma surgeon that don't have one. Trauma surgeons are general surgeons. The general surgeon is the trauma surgeon. When you do general surgery, you can do a fellowship in trauma, but basically general surgery has always been involved with trauma care. So we're short 2,400 of these across the USA. The ACS itself, the American College of Surgeons itself, has said that within the next 5 years, we're going to face a shortage of nearly 20,000 general surgeons. And that's frightening because you're talking about access to competent surgical care. And if you don't have that, you're basically on the same level as a developing country. You're no longer a Western country with, state of the art medical surgical care at that point in time. And instead of trying to give the ACS its dues, they realize this. I mean, they put these figures out. So what they've done in terms of trying to correct this or fix the problem, they've instituted things like mentoring programs where a young surgeon could be mentored by a more experienced surgeon for a year or more after their training, which never used to have to be done. But at the same time, they're saying, one surgeon said this outright, said they're having a hard time finding enough, for example, black surgeons to mentor the black surgeon, the new black surgeons. So again, they continue with this whole racial concordance lunacy, as far as I'm concerned, in terms of how they're trying to accomplish this. And here they're facing this massive, oncoming crisis in surgery, and still promoting things.
Are the surgeons asking for mentors of the same demographic, or is this coming from the top down saying, oh, no, we can't pair? Because, I mean, if I was wanting to be mentored, I personally wouldn't care. I just would want whoever is the most talented surgeon to be mentoring me.
My reading of this is that's more top down, but to some extent, I think it works both ways. And the reason I say that is that I know that, a lot of, for example, a lot of the newer surgeons coming out of training, what's the word I would use, are fragile. They can't handle criticism well. They don't handle pressure well. And so
which are critical and life-saving situations when you're a surgeon.
They may feel more comfortable if they have a surgeon of their race or of their gender, for example. Okay. Surgery's hard. I mean, those are the hardest years of my life were in my training. And there were many moments when, I got my hand slapped, one attending my chief professor when I was in plastic surgery at one time said, I don't know why I ever took you into my residency. I can't teach you anything. But I left in his good graces. I was browbeaten. I was criticized and whatnot. But, you learn to take those things in stride, and if anything, a surgeon cannot be a shrinking violet. You've got to make life and death decisions, and you have to make them quickly. And you can't be opening a book, and you can't be looking in your computer, and you can't be turning to someone around you to give you advice in that moment.
Yeah.
And so if we're producing an entire generation of surgeons that don't have that resiliency and that competency, we've got a big problem.
How do we build resiliency back in our surgical programs?
We have to take back all of these things that we've lost. We have to get rid of DEI, for one thing. I believe we have to get rid of DEI completely out of these programs. We have to
get back to what?
Excellence, competence, to standards. We have to set standards that everyone has to meet, regardless. We can't lower the standards because someone is in a disadvantaged group and not represented the same. What we have to do is take those groups and bring them up. But that's going to be a generational thing. You're going to do that starting with, K through 12 schools and into colleges, and so it's not going to happen overnight. And it's not the job of the ACS to do that. The job of the ACS is to promote excellence in surgery.
Mm-hmm.
It's not to fix society's problems.
And that's so that every person that comes and walks through the door knows that no matter which surgeon walks in that room, they have all met the exact same standards.
You need to know that. You really, and that does not, it's surgery is a very human endeavor. You're going to get bad surgeons. There's always been bad surgeons no matter what. But you at least have to have a process that is an established process that gives you the best chance of
Mm-hmm.
producing the most competent surgeons possible. And we have had that for generations in this country. We started the residency system here. Johns Hopkins was where this all began, where they began to train surgeons according to standardized methods to produce surgeons that all had at least basic competency. And you build from that. Some surgeons never become that great. Some surgeons build in the competence and become, icons, and stars in the field.
Mm-hmm.
But they all have the same basic competency. I kind of semi-facetiously, semi-seriously tell people around me, don't trust any surgeon who's under 50 or under 40 because they came up through the system of getting rewarded for participating and not be rewarded for excellence. And, they tend to be fragile. They tend to be, I've seen this personally where a lot of surgeons will refrain from doing things that they're clearly able to do because they're fearful of taking on certain things. They won't take on a complex operation, even if they've trained to know how to do it, because they don't want the responsibility of having to deal with the possibility of complications, which we all have to deal with. So you build it back up by establishing your standards and holding to them, getting rid of things that have no beneficial effect. And DEI is being, backpedaled on everywhere these days because it's been shown to be not only unproductive but divisive and toxic. And you have to allow the surgical professors and mentors and medical school persons to teach and to reprimand and to hold back and to grade and to do these things without fear that they're going to be somehow they may lose a career if they hold back a student and the diversity administrator doesn't like the way that this was done. You can have abuses on both sides. I mean, you're never going to get a perfect system, but I think we've gone so far in the other direction that unless the pendulum begins to swing back where excellence becomes a priority, people are going to lose their trust in the surgeons they see. I have a hard time, knowing at this point in time who I would trust. And I'm fortunate because I can, with my background, I can advise my family and friends, and I know myself if there's someone out there that I can trust to do something. Most people don't have that privilege of being able to do that.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the Do No Harm group. Can you tell me some of the background on that?
It was founded by Stanley Goldfarb. Dr. Goldfarb was, as I mentioned, I believe he was the director of curriculum at University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine. And this administrator came in and said, we have too much science. And he penned an opinion piece that was published in the in the Wall Street Journal, I believe it was. And he didn't title it this, but they titled it this, Take to Aspirin and Call Me by My Pronouns, which went, I guess, in a sense, viral. And ultimately, he made it into a book. And the book was basically on the loss of standards and the promotion of diversity, equity, inclusion over and above competence and excellence. And he was literally hounded out of UPenn. I mean, he lost his position as the dean of curriculum. He's not even mentioned anymore. And he was a highly respected, highly published nephrologist, as expert in kidney diseases, and was basically just, I guess the term is totally deplatformed out of Penn. And he started the organization Do No Harm to try to restore excellence in the medicine.
How was he trying to do that?
Well, by a number of means. He started to look at places that were instituting initiatives, DEI initiatives, requiring things like DEI. What do they call those things? Students had to write some kind of a declaration or an essay stating their commitment to DEI and what they have done to promote DEI so far in their short lives. And you can't have these statements. You can't make students, take an ideological stand as a condition of being admitted, for example, to medical school. So places that were doing that, they started to sue, and very successfully got a number of schools to drop these things. They began to testify in states that were looking to either promote or ban DEI on the effects of these different initiatives on the quality of education and the quality of the doctors. And they started to have a lot of success. I mean, the organization is not even 3 years old yet. And it had tremendous success with respect to winning some lawsuits and getting schools to drop their DEI requirements and for students and that sort of thing. They've also taken on along the way because, and this not to sidetrack, but during this whole time that DEI has been such a issue, the specter of gender ideology raised its awful head, and you have gender affirming care in children, and they've taken that on as an issue that they're very, very involved with. And of course, the whole issue of affirming trans individuals and providing good medical care. No one denies that people deserve good medical care regardless of what they believe or who they think they are or anything else.
Where does the phrase "do no harm" come from?
It's oddly enough, it's not in the Hippocratic Oath. That's a great question. I wish I had to look that up because I wish I could answer it. I don't know who first said that.
I actually thought it was in the Hippocratic Oath. I thought that's what doctors take that oath for.
I was actually surprised. My medical school class did not take the Hippocratic Oath.
Huh.
We took the Oath of Maimonides, which is a very similar. It's worded differently, but it's an old Greek oath that seemed to be a little bit more, I guess, age relevant to our. It doesn't pray to the god Asclepius, sort of thing. But we did take a sacred oath in medical school. I went back and I looked up the two and I said, gee, do no harm doesn't show up anywhere in here. But it's a distillation of everything in the Hippocratic Oath. I mean, if you look at what those things are saying and you want to distill it into 3 words, you would distill it into do no harm. The first and foremost thing in dealing with the patient is you don't want to hurt the patient. And so the whole issue of gender affirming care, of course, goes to what we're doing to children and whether we are harming or not harming children. And I believe we're harming children terribly, that this is going to be one of the blackest stains in the history of medicine that we've ever seen. And Do No Harm has been very, very active on that front, working with activists and doctors. And they put out the first data set on all the hospitals in the country that are providing gender affirming care for minors, so that if you want to know if a hospital is doing trans surgery and putting in puberty blockers in prepubertal children, you can go to the Do No Harm database and look that up. So they provide a lot of resources out there. And of course, they get a lot of publicity and they're quoted a lot. They've done these systematic reviews, which are very scientific based. They take studies and review the studies, and they assess whether the study is properly done, whether the premises and the methods used are proper, whether the interpretation of the results have been correct, and so forth. And so a lot of resources are available. I think they've reached, I want to say 15,000 members already in a very short span of time.
Wow.
And they're always looking for others to join in that particular battle to do this. So both DEI and gender affirming care have become the predominant issues that Do No Harm is involved with.
And what are some of the things that, as a patient, if you are concerned about this creeping in, or you are concerned about knowing if your surgeon, for instance, is qualified, what do you do?
You have limited options. Sometimes the best option is to ask people around you, hey, who did you see and were you happy with the care you got? I'm a big advocate for getting second opinions. If you go see a doctor for whatever reason, you may leave there fully confident and trusting and so forth, and that's great. Or you may say, well, I don't know if that's the best idea. And so getting a second opinion is not a bad thing to do. You look for board certification. Any of the American Board of Medical Specialties has.
But what does that mean? Like, to become board certified, are there certain tests you have to pass? Are there certain grades you have to get
Absolutely.
to get board certified? So is that still a trusted organization that you can know if they got this certification, that they met certain requirements, regardless of gender, race, whatever? Like, we know that every single person that has this qualification passed the same standards.
There is the American Board of Medical Specialties, the ABMS, has 24, I believe, primary boards. The Board of Surgery is one, Board of Plastic Surgery is another, the American Board of Plastic Surgery, American Board of Pediatrics, and every one of those is the official organization that is authorized by the ABMS to certify doctors in specialties. So if you want to become a board certified plastic surgeon, you have to go through a residency program that is accredited by the ABMS. That program has to have meet certain qualifications. They have to be able to provide this much experience and time and so forth.
Well, I just realized that people are performing plastic surgery that are not board certified.
That's a whole other. we could spend an hour.
Which is terrifying.
Yeah.
I mean, man, I learned so much as I dove into all this. I said, wait a second. There's just a lot of education on the part of the patient that I think needs to happen in general. But now I know, only look for these board certified surgeons.
Yeah, you can just say you're board certified and not say in what. In Florida, actually, you can't do that. You cannot claim certification that you don't actually possess. So they've tried to kind of get rid of some of the cowboys out there that are doing these things. Anybody can call themselves a plastic surgeon. They can't call themselves a board certified plastic surgeon unless they have passed the examination by the American Board of Plastic Surgery. And going back to your original question, every one of those boards has an examination process. And that process in a medical board, it may be just an examination. And oftentimes it's both an oral and a written examination. So not only do you have to sit there and spend hours answering questions on a written exam, but they will sit you in a room in front of a bunch of your professors, if you will, and they'll throw questions at you and ask you about situations and what you would do and this sort of thing.
Is there a practical component?
When I did my certification process, I had to submit a log of every operation that I had performed over the previous year. And they selected certain operations to quiz me on. And they also quizzed me on operations that they had selected. This is an interesting point because I've been in communication with a resident today, still a resident in plastic surgery, very, very committed, conscientious individual. They want to be the best they can be. And they contacted me to find out what they could do in order to get the most out of their training. Apparently, some medical suites of residents have read some of the things that I've written and whatnot. And so they reached out to me. And in talking to this person, I learned things that just shocked the heck out of me. And one of those things was that this log is supposed to be a log of operations that you have participated in. And you're supposed to specify, whether you were the primary surgeon or if you were an assistant. And typically the only operations that count are the ones that you're the surgeon on, or you're the first assistant where you're actually directly assisting the surgeon. That would count as your surgical experience. Now, some programs, including the one this individual is in, they allow you to list in there as your surgical experience operations that you have simply watched. So if you go into an operating room and you stand behind the anesthesia screen, you look over the screen and you watch what they're doing, you can list that as part of your surgical experience. And I can tell you, you can watch 100 operations. It's not going to do
No.
anything to help you to perform that operation when the time comes.
So as a question you should ask your doctor as you are vetting your plastic surgeon, how many hours of hands-on operations do you have? Or
who would think to do that, right?
Right.
I mean, if you say you're board certified, you make certain assumptions. The assumptions are that that board has deemed that you are a competent surgeon to be doing what you're doing, and there you go. Unfortunately, that assumption is not always the correct assumption. And the other thing too, I sometimes have to be careful because I'm really big into nuance and context, and I don't want to paint everybody with the same brush. There are excellent surgeons out there coming out of training programs. There are excellent training programs. There are programs that basically the attending has, the director has said, I don't care what anybody says. I'm training my surgeons this way because my name is on that residency certificate, and I'm not putting on anybody who's not qualified. So there's excellent stuff. But what percentage of surgeons can you accept that have been promoted despite being not fully competent? I mean, where do you draw the line? At 5%, 10%, 20%? And that's one of the problems, is that we have so many places where things are being done that are counter to the standard of excellence and competence, that it's making it difficult. And again, this goes back to trust. When I get onto an airplane this afternoon to fly back home, I don't give a second thought about whether I'm going to arrive in one piece or not. Maybe I should, but I don't, because I trust that that pilot has been vetted by the FAA and the powers that be as being competent to fly that plane and get me home. And when I go into emergency room and I have no say in who my surgeon is going to be, I would like to be able to have the same level of trust that whoever comes into that room is going to be someone competent to take care of me. And I'm afraid that what's happening is we're losing that. And once that is lost, is number one, it's very hard to get back.
Mm-hmm.
And two is you've taken a profession that is one of the only professions that does take what I consider to be a sacred oath. There are many professions where, you say some kind of a pledge, but this is more than a pledge.
Mm-hmm.
This is, when you're a doctor, that's first and foremost. That, it comes before your family. I mean, I hate to say this, but if I'm at my kid's birthday party and I get called to the emergency room, I can't say, oh, I'm not going to go because I'm at my kid's birthday party. I've got to go and take care of that individual. Mm-hmm. And I will do the best for them no matter what. I don't care if they're the driver of the car that was hit by a drunk driver, or if they're the drunk driver that killed the family. I will provide that individual with the best care that I can regardless, because that's what I trained to do. And that's what my oath says I will do. And a lot of younger surgeons have come in to the system that feel like most important for them is work-life balance. You hear this term a lot, work-life balance. Where, once they're done, they have, they're at 5 o'clock, they're done. I mean, they're gone. One of the things, this goes into something else. In 2003. Yeah, around 2003, I believe it was. Don't hold me to that. But they passed a law across the country that limited residency hours to 80 hours a week. You could make a resident work in the hospital for more than 80 hours a week, and you could make them work for more than 24 hours at a stretch without at least a 24-hour
Sounds
break.
like you probably don't want a brain surgeon who has not had any sleep for 24 hours operating on a
Absolutely.
highly critical. I mean, so that makes sense to me.
In a residency, your hand is being held. You're not independent.
Okay.
You're being constantly monitored and watched. But when I trained, working a 90 to 100-hour week was not uncommon. Mm-hmm. And an every other night schedule was not uncommon. I'm not saying that everybody needs to do this because I did this, but most of your learning is done in a residency in the after hours at night when you're pretty much, and you're the person in the hospital. And you have to learn to think when you're tired. You have to, if I'm in practice and I've just been up all night and I have an emergency come in the next morning, I can't put that off because I'm tired. I've got to be able to work tired and perform. And so a lot of young surgeons are not, and even other doctors' specialties are not being trained in that manner. And what happens is you lose
for the mental
ownership.
toughness.
one of the statistics I heard about program directors is that they feel that something like 1/3 of their trainees do not have a sense of ownership for their patients. When I admitted a patient, and I'd be on for 36 hours at a stretch, I'd admit the patient, I'd do the workup. Typically, if they had to go to surgery, I would be there either doing the surgery or assisting them. And so there was always a very strong sense of ownership for your patients. If you're doing basically shift work, then you lose that. The handoffs, you lose continuity. And then when you go into practice, the same applies. You don't have that ownership of patients. And here's another statistic for you that's kind of scary in my opinion. 90% of doctors today are not independent practitioners like I was. They're basically employees of corporations and major medical centers.
And beholden to the insurance companies.
They like the fact that they have regular hours. They like the fact that they have, paid vacation, paid retirement, dental, medical, all these things that I had to provide for myself as an independent practitioner. And again, you don't have the sense of ownership, and you don't have this commitment to the patient that I believe is an all-encompassing commitment.
Sure. Which is
not to say that, you don't need to have time for yourself, but first 4 years of my practice, I was the only plastic surgeon for the entire county, and I was on call 24/7 for for 2 hospitals for 4 years. It never occurred to me to do otherwise. It never occurred to me to say, I'm not going in today to see a patient in the ER because I've worked too hard this week and I'm tired. When I got a partner, it was, wow, this is great. But that was just the mindset that, that I had.
What was the longest surgery you ever remember doing in one sitting?
In one sitting without leaving the OR, somewhere around 9-10 hours.
Is that pretty typical for your line of work?
No, I wouldn't say that long an operation is not typical. No, that's an outlier. But, the funny thing is it sounds like, oh my gosh, you were there for 10 hours and you never took a break. The 10 hours goes by fast. You don't feel the need to use the restroom. You don't get hungry. You just go. In my early years, I was doing a major operation, a microvascular operation on a patient's leg, and we'd work the entire day. And I had an assistant who finally left. I said, okay, I got it. You can leave. And this is before we had cell phones. There's no cell phones. So he left, and next thing I know, my anastomosis blew up on one of my blood vessels. And so I had to go in and repair that. And I was exhausted. I was just, but there's no choice. If I hadn't done what I did, the patient probably would have lost their leg. So you suck it up, you put your big boy pants on or big girl pants on, and you do what has to be done. That's what medicine is all about. But hopefully, and it was successful. The operation was successful. Everything went well. But hopefully you do it with, a level of competence and a commitment to excellence. And you have the background that allows you to do that.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Bosshardt, we'll finish this conversation with, in your opinion, what would you like to see happen to get the trust reinstilled back in the medical institution and the level of competency raised back up to a level that puts America at the forefront of being the best in everything, especially when it comes to the medical profession?
I think you have to have that stated commitment, and you have to honor that commitment. It kind of begins by not banning people like myself that raise objections. Okay. A professional organization that bans someone for life for voicing an objection to installing ideology into a professional organization, there's a problem there. And I think that we have to get that out. We have to have conversations. Medicine is always a dynamic process. You're learning things that you were doing a year ago, you don't do anymore. And you don't do it because some outlier said that maybe something else is better. So number one, open discussion, debate, even on controversial issues, get the social justice stuff out of medicine. We're not social justice warriors. We're not there to fix the world's problems. We're there to provide a particular unique service that only we are trained to do. And we have to be excellent in that. We can't settle for anything less. And as I said earlier, we have to raise up our standards and uphold those standards. And everyone that goes through has to meet those standards. We can't lower standards just because someone is in some way disadvantaged in that, and by that standard. That's not a good thing, obviously, for that to happen. So what we have to do is not the organization, but society has to go back and say, we got to bring up these disadvantaged, individuals to a level where they can then, compete at the same level and meet the same standards that everybody else has to meet. So a recommitment to excellence and competence, particularly in medicine and in my particular area of surgery more than any other, because we're cutting people open for a living, basically, and you can't do that unless you're committed to that.
Well, Dr. Bosshardt, we really appreciate your time, appreciate your story, and we'll be Can you let everybody know where they can follow your journey? And I know you have a book that's out as well, so tell everybody where they can get that as well.
Well, I'm a writer, just by my passion is writing. Now that I'm not practicing medicine, I have a Substack for people that are familiar with Substack. It's Richard T. Bosshardt, my initial T, Richard T. Bosshardt, MD, at substack.com or .substack.com. So they can look up Substack in my name. I write a lot of not just medical stuff in there, other things as well, but a lot of my writing pertains to these issues. The book has nothing to do with this, basically. They say write what you know about, and I know about plastic surgery. I trained in a very, very unique institution with what is with a person considered to be the top plastic surgeon of modern times. He was voted the plastic surgeon top of the millennium, Dr. Ralph Millard in Miami, Florida. And those 2 years were incredibly stressful, but incredibly rewarding, and set me on a 35-year career. So the book is called The Making of a Plastic Surgeon, 2 years in the crucible learning the art and science. That's available on Amazon. I guess you call that a plug.
Absolutely. Yeah, plug away.
But yeah, I'm on my Substack. I do try to put things into articles. I've been successful with articles in National Review, City Journal, Wall Street Journal, Washington Examiner, and others. So you might pick up my name here and there. And of course, here, I'm delighted to be here. I can't tell you how much I appreciate having a chance to sit here and chat, because sometimes there's just not enough time to go over these things, and having this opportunity is fantastic. Thank you.
Well, we're just glad that you're here, and thank you for shedding light on this very important issue. And we'll definitely have everybody check you out and follow along with your journey.